Sometimes you look at the maps from 1941 and realize the Germans were this close. Just a few kilometers from the Kremlin. Soviet soldiers could see the spires of Moscow's churches through their binoculars. Guderian's tanks stood in Khimki, practically a suburb of the capital. One more push, one more strike, and everything could have gone very differently. But before we continue, drop a comment below. Where are you from? And what's the weather like there? I'd genuinely love to know. Enjoy the video. Today, we're talking about Stalin's worst nightmare, the fall of Moscow. December 1941. Army Group Center, under von Bock's command, assaults the Soviet capital. The temperature, -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers are freezing. Their equipment won't start, yet they keep advancing. Soviet troops, exhausted, hold the line. Zhukov pulls reserves from Siberia. Muscovites dig trenches and build barricades. The tension is unbearable. Any moment now, either the Germans break through or the Soviet counteroffensive drives them back. In reality, the latter happened. On December 5th and 6th, the Red Army launched its counterattack, pushing the Wehrmacht 100 to 250 kilometers away from Moscow. It was the first major victory over the Germans, proof that the Blitzkrieg had failed, that Hitler wasn't invincible. Moscow held, and that changed the entire course of the war. But what if the Germans had broken through? What if Guderian found a weak spot in the defenses? What if the Siberian divisions arrived a day or two late? What if the deep frost had come just a bit later? Let's imagine this nightmare and see what a world with a swastika flying over the Kremlin might have looked like. First, how did the Germans even get this close? June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins. 3 million German soldiers cross the Soviet border. The Blitzkrieg is in full swing. In the first weeks, the Wehrmacht advances 300 to 400 kilometers into the USSR.
Encirclements, cauldrons, hundreds of thousands captured. The Red Army suffers catastrophic losses. By September, the Germans take Kiev. 650,000 Soviet soldiers captured, the largest encirclement in military history. Leningrad is under siege. In the south, they push toward Rostov, while Army Group Center aims for the ultimate prize, Moscow. September 30th, Operation Typhoon begins. The goal? Take the Soviet capital before winter. October brings more German victories. The Vyazma Cauldron, another 600,000 prisoners. The road to Moscow is open. Panic grips the city. October 15th to 16th, the Moscow Panic. People flee, loot stores, stampede train stations. NKVD troops execute looters on sight. Government offices evacuate to Kuibyshev. Stalin hesitates. Should he stay or go? He stays. November 7th, a military parade on Red Square, an incredible propaganda move. Troops march straight to the front. Morale lifts. Moscow will fight. But the Germans keep coming. By late November, Wehrmacht forward units reach Khimki, just 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. German officers peer at the Kremlin towers through binoculars. December arrives and the temperature plummets. -25 degrees Celsius, -30 degrees Celsius, -35 degrees Celsius. German equipment freezes. Soldiers in summer uniforms succumb to the cold. Supply lines collapse, yet they push forward. This is their last chance. If they don't take Moscow now, the war drags on. And a prolonged war means defeat. Zhukov gathers his final reserves. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter, arrive at the front. The plan? Let the Germans exhaust themselves, then strike. On December 5th, it happens. The Soviet counteroffensive catches the Wehrmacht off guard. Frozen and depleted, they can't hold the line. The retreat begins. But that's reality. What if things had gone differently? Let's find the point of no return. Imagine, December 2nd, 1941, 3 days before the Soviet counterattack. Guderian finds a weak spot south of Moscow. His tanks break through. Simultaneously, Hopner attacks from the north. The pincers close. Zhukov tries to plug the gap, but reserves are thin. The Siberian divisions are still 2 days away, delayed by rail issues. 2 days are all the Germans need. December 3rd, Guderian's and Hopner's tanks link up east of Moscow. 1 million Soviet soldiers are encircled. The city is cut off. December 4th, German assault troops enter Moscow. Street fighting erupts. Soviet soldiers battle for every house, every street. Red Square becomes a battlefield. The Kremlin is shelled. Stalin orders an evacuation, but it's too late. Airfields are under fire, railways severed. He's trapped. December 5th. On the day the Soviet counteroffensive should have begun, the swastika rises over the Kremlin. German soldiers take photos on Red Square. Goebbels rejoices. The Reich's greatest propaganda victory. Moscow has fallen. The Soviet Union is decapitated. But here's where it gets interesting. Capturing Moscow isn't the same as winning the war. What happens next? Stalin is either killed in the assault, captured, or escapes at the last moment. Let's explore all three, because everything hinges on this. Option 1. Stalin is killed. A German bomb hits the Kremlin bunker, or he shoots himself rather than surrender. The Soviet leadership is in shock. No leader, no chain of command. Surviving Politburo members, Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, Zhukov, gather in Kuibyshev. They try to take control, but chaos erupts. The USSR has no succession mechanism. Stalin was the system. Without him, it collapses. Beria and Molotov vie for power. Zhukov demands emergency military authority. The NKVD and army eye each other with suspicion. Republics consider secession. Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians. Why die for a Russian Moscow? The Germans exploit this weakness. Army Group Center doesn't stop at Moscow. They push east toward Gorky, Kazan, the Volga. The goal? Split the USSR in half. In the south, Army Group South races for the Caucasus and its oil.
In the north, Leningrad remains besieged. By spring 1942, the Germans control a vast territory, all European USSR up to the Volga. Leningrad falls after 9 months. Kiev, Minsk, Moscow, Leningrad, every major Soviet city is taken. The Red Army retreats beyond the Urals. Millions are dead or captured. In Kuibyshev, a new government forms. Suppose Molotov, the most experienced diplomat, takes charge. He realizes continuing the war is madness. The USSR is bleeding out. Industry, partially evacuated beyond the Urals, operates at half capacity. Supply lines are collapsing. The people are exhausted. Famine begins. So Molotov does the unthinkable. He offers Hitler peace. Negotiations begin on neutral ground, perhaps in Stockholm. Hitler dictates the terms. Brutal, humiliating. But the USSR has no choice. Here they are. The Soviet Union acknowledges the loss of all territory west of the Urals. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, most of Russia, all fall under German control. A puppet Russian state is established, with its capital in Smolensk or even Moscow. Nominally independent, but in reality, a German protectorate. Leningrad is renamed Adolfstadt, or some other German designation. Originally, Hitler planned to raze the city, but the Germans ultimately decide to keep it as an administrative center. Ukraine becomes the breadbasket of the Reich. Caucasian oil flows to Germany. The Baltics undergo forced Germanization, and what remains of the USSR? A pitiful rump state beyond the Urals. The new capital, somewhere like Sverdlovsk or Novosibirsk. The territory stretches from the Urals to the Pacific, Siberia, the Far East, Central Asia. The population? Maybe 50 to 70 million, down from 200. Industry crippled, the army shattered. No longer a great power, but a regional player at best. The peace treaty is signed in the summer of 1942. The Eastern Front is over. Hitler celebrates Germany's greatest victory. Lebensraum achieved, the Slavs crushed. The colonization of the East begins. Now imagine the occupied territories. Hitler implements Generalplan Ost. Millions of Slavs marked for extermination or deportation. The survivors enslaved. German settlers seize the best lands. Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, transformed into vast plantations feeding the Reich. The Jews. In this timeline, the Holocaust escalates, accelerated by the millions of Soviet Jews now under German control. Death camps operate at full capacity. By war's end, 6 million, 10 million, perhaps more. The scale of genocide is monstrous. But back to the bigger picture. Germany has won in the East. It now commands vast resources. But the war in the West continues. Britain refuses to surrender. America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and now Hitler can focus entirely on the Western Front. By spring 1943, Germany launches massive bombing campaigns against England. New jet fighters, V-2 rockets, British cities burn. Churchill is desperate. America supplies weapons, but cannot land in Europe. The continent is firmly under German control. And Japan? In reality, Japan fought the US and lost. But in this scenario, with Germany's victory over the USSR, Japan gains freedom of action. It seizes the Soviet Far East, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, perhaps even parts of Siberia. The remnants of the USSR are now trapped between Germany in the West and Japan in the East. By mid-1943, Britain is on the brink of surrender. U-boats decimate Atlantic convoys. American supplies falter. The population, exhausted by bombing, begins whispering of peace. In 1944, an armistice is signed. Britain accepts the status quo. Germany dominates continental Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. The British Empire remains, but England exits the war. America now stands alone against Germany and Japan. But the US holds a trump card that changes everything. In 1945, America develops the atomic bomb. Only this time, it's not used against Japan, but Germany. The first bomb falls on Berlin, the second on Hamburg. Hitler is killed. Germany reels. Yet the Germans too had pursued nuclear research, and with captured Soviet physicists and access to Soviet uranium mines, they succeeded. By 1946, Germany has its own bomb. A nuclear standoff begins. The world teeters on the edge of atomic war. The US, Germany, and Japan, 3 nuclear superpowers. A Cold War, but not bipolar, tripartite, and far more dangerous than in reality. The German Reich stretches from France to the Urals. America controls the Western Hemisphere and the remnants of the British Empire. Japan dominates Asia and the Pacific. 3 blocks glare at each other with hatred and fear. And what of the USSR's remnants beyond the Urals? A destitute, backward state. No industrial centers, most of its population gone, stripped of European resources. Stalin is gone. New leaders take charge. Perhaps the regime softens, lacking the strength for brutal repression. Or maybe it tightens its grip, desperate to hold on. Now, consider the second scenario. Stalin is captured alive. This changes everything. The leader of the people, the Red Tsar, the man everyone feared, now a German prisoner. For Hitler, an unimaginable trophy. For the USSR, a catastrophe. Goebbels stages a show trial. Stalin stands accused in Berlin. Crimes against humanity, Bolshevik terror, the murder of millions. The irony? Many charges are true, but they come from Nazis committing atrocities of their own. Stalin is sentenced to death and publicly executed. The spectacle is broadcast worldwide. A propaganda triumph for Germany, a psychological blow to the USSR. The invincible leader was mortal. The system crumbles. In Kuibyshev, Soviet leaders scramble to regroup. But without Stalin, they're lost. Power struggles erupt. Beria purges rivals, blaming everyone for the defeat. The NKVD arrests generals.
The army revolts. A civil war brews within the USSR.
Germany exploits the chaos, pushing further east, toward the Volga, the Caucasus, the Urals. Resistance weakens. By late 1942, the USSR effectively ceases to exist. Isolated pockets of resistance linger in Siberia and Central Asia, but it's no longer a unified state. Germany imposes its order across the former Soviet lands. Puppet states emerge: Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian, Caucasian. All nominally independent, all Berlin's puppets. German colonization begins. Third scenario. Stalin escapes. He flees east at the last moment, by plane, armored train, whatever means necessary. He relocates beyond the Urals, to Sverdlovsk or Novosibirsk. From there, he directs the resistance. This is the most intriguing outcome, because the war doesn't end. Yes, Moscow has fallen. Yes, Germany controls European Russia, but the USSR fights on. Stalin lives. The Red Army retreats but isn't destroyed. Industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, keeps producing. A protracted war begins. The Germans, like Napoleon before them, are bogged down. They hold cities, but partisans rule the forests. Supply lines are constantly attacked. German soldiers realize this war will never end. Stalin directs the partisan movement from Sverdlovsk. Millions of Soviet citizens go underground. Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian partisans blow up bridges, railways, and attack German garrisons. The occupation turns into a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. Hitler is enraged. He orders brutal reprisals. For every German killed, 100 hostages are executed. Entire villages are burned to the ground. But this only fuels the resistance. The harsher the occupation, the more people join the partisans. By 1943, Germany controls Europe, but is bogged down in an endless war in the East, draining its resources. Meanwhile, America and Britain are not sitting idly by in the West. They realize they must act while Germany is tied up in Russia.
In 1944, the Normandy landings take place, as in reality. But now the Germans have more forces in the West because they had to leave troops in Russia to fight the partisans. The Western Front is open. Germany is fighting on 2 fronts. Stalin sees an opportunity. In the spring of 1945, he launches a massive counteroffensive from the east.
The Red Army, which had been building up its strength beyond the Urals for 5 years, crashes into German positions. Partisans rise up in the rear. German defenses collapse. By the end of 1945, Soviet forces liberate Moscow. It's a symbolic moment. For 4 years, the swastika hung over the Kremlin. Now, the red flag is raised again. The war is not over, but the tide has turned. The Allies advance from the west, the Red Army from the east. By early 1946, Germany is caught in a pincer, but then the atomic bomb comes into play. The Americans drop it on Berlin. Hitler is killed. Germany surrenders. The war is over. But at what cost? In reality, World War II claimed around 60 million lives. In this alternate scenario, the toll is much higher. Moscow was under occupation for 4 years. Millions died from starvation, disease, and executions. The Holocaust was even more extensive. The partisan war devastated entire regions. Most importantly, the USSR is severely weakened. Yes, it emerged victorious in the end, but the losses are catastrophic. The European part of the country is in ruins, industry is destroyed, and the population decimated. The USSR in 1946 is not a superpower, but a crippled, exhausted nation. The post-war division of Europe unfolds differently. America controls all of Western and Central Europe. They don't trust the weakened USSR. The Red Army didn't reach Berlin first, the Americans did. As a result, Eastern Europe doesn't fall under Soviet control. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all are within America's sphere of influence. The USSR regains its pre-war borders, possibly without the Baltic states.
The Americans insist on the independence of the Baltic republics as a buffer. The Cold War still begins. But the USSR is much weaker. It has no satellite states in Eastern Europe, no industrial base for an arms race. Stalin tries to rebuild the country, but it will take decades. And what of Moscow? The city is liberated, but in ruins. 4 years of German occupation took their toll. Many landmarks are destroyed. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, if it survived Stalin's purges, is now completely obliterated. The Kremlin is damaged. The city's population has shrunk dramatically. Rebuilding Moscow becomes a symbolic project. Stalin pours vast resources into it. He wants to prove that the USSR is alive. Moscow rises from the ashes. By the 1950s, the city is rebuilt, but it's a different Moscow, not the one that existed before the war. Stalin dies in 1953, as in reality, but his legacy is different. He's not the triumphant victor who took Berlin. He's the leader who lost Moscow, but managed to reclaim it. It's a dual assessment. On one hand, he's a failure who lost the capital. On the other, a stubborn fighter who didn't give up even after such a blow. After Stalin's death, the thaw begins. Khrushchev comes to power and denounces the cult of personality. But the criticism of Stalin is sharper here because he lost Moscow. Many ask, could this have been avoided? A re-evaluation of the war begins. The USSR of the 1960s and 1970s in this alternate scenario is weaker than in reality. It doesn't have the same global influence, no Warsaw Pact. Eastern Europe is under American control, which dominates, but the USSR stubbornly holds on. It develops nuclear weapons, launches satellites. Gagarin still goes to space. It's too important a symbol. But the space race is more intense. America leads in every aspect. The USSR catches up, but can't overtake. The moon landing is an American triumph. The USSR remains in the shadows. By the 1980s, the USSR is exhausted.
The economy can't sustain the arms race. Afghanistan is the same disaster. Perestroika starts earlier because the crisis is more acute, and the collapse happens faster. By the early 1990s, the USSR is gone. But unlike in reality, where the dissolution was relatively peaceful, here it's accompanied by conflicts. The USSR is weaker, the wounds of the war haven't healed, and national tensions are sharper. Russia in the 1990s and 2000s, in this alternate scenario, is even more chaotic. The economy is in shambles. Oligarchs plunder the country. Chechen wars, political instability, a demographic crisis. Moscow, of course, is rebuilt, but the memory of the fall of 1941 still lingers. And what of world history? America, after winning the war, becomes the absolute hegemon. Without a strong USSR to balance it, the Cold War is shorter and less intense. There's no Cuban Missile Crisis because the USSR isn't strong enough to place missiles in Cuba. There's no Berlin Wall because Berlin is entirely under American control. Europe recovers faster, without the division into East and West. The European Union is formed earlier. By the 1980s, Europe is a powerful economic bloc, but under the American umbrella. Germany is rebuilt, but under strict control. Denazification is thorough. China develops differently. Without a strong USSR to support them, the communists have a harder time winning the civil war. Perhaps China remains divided longer, or the communists still win, but their regime is softer because there's no Soviet model to emulate. Japan, after its defeat, recovers as in reality, becoming an economic miracle. But without the Soviet threat in the north, its role in Asian geopolitics is different. America uses Japan as a base to project power in Asia. The Middle East is an interesting case. Without the USSR supporting Arab regimes, Israel dominates. The Arab-Israeli wars end sooner. The Palestinian issue is resolved in Israel's favor. The oil crises of the 1970s either don't happen or are milder. Latin America, without Soviet support for leftist movements, remains firmly under US control. The Cuban Revolution either doesn't happen or is quickly suppressed. Nicaragua, Chile, other countries, all are under American influence. By the 2000s, the world is unipolar. America stands as the sole superpower. Russia is a regional power with nuclear capabilities, but lacks global ambitions. China, perhaps, is weaker than it is in reality. And what of culture? In this alternate reality, Soviet cinema, literature, and art are steeped in the trauma of Moscow's fall. This is the central theme. Films depict heroic resistance, books tell stories of partisans, and songs celebrate the liberation of the capital. The cult of victory exists, but it is different, not triumphant, but tragic. Russian nationalism forms around the idea of resurrection after catastrophe. We lost Moscow, but we reclaimed it. This duality evokes both pride and shame. Monuments to the fallen stand on every corner. The day of Moscow's liberation is the primary holiday, surpassing Victory Day in importance. German culture, too, is altered. In reality, Germans have deeply processed their Nazi past. In this alternate timeline, they must also grapple with the fact of Moscow's capture. On one hand, it was a military triumph. On the other, it was part of a monstrous crime. How does one live with that? German intellectuals wrestle with this question. Writers pen novels about moral responsibility. Filmmakers produce movies about the atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht in occupied Moscow. Society is divided. Elderly veterans nostalgically recall the great victory, while the younger generation is horrified. American culture revels in triumph. Hollywood produces blockbusters about defeating Nazism. America is the savior of the world. Without the US, Europe would have fallen. This becomes part of the national myth. American exceptionalism reaches its peak. And what do ordinary people in this alternate reality think? Russians remember the occupation of Moscow as a national nightmare. Grandmothers tell their grandchildren harrowing stories of German soldiers in the streets of the capital. This shapes a unique identity. We survived the worst. Second and third generation Germans feel a sense of guilt. Their grandfathers took Moscow, but at what cost? Millions dead, the Holocaust, war crimes. Young Germans travel to Moscow, lay flowers at memorials, and seek to atone for their fathers' sins. Americans take pride in their role. They liberated Europe. They defeated Nazism. Without them, the world would have descended into darkness. This reinforces their belief in their own exceptionalism. America is the force of good. America is the leader of the free world. Poles, Czechs, and Hungarians are grateful to America for liberation, but they also remember that the USSR fought. Many believe that if Moscow had not fallen, the war would have ended sooner. There is a dual sentiment: respect for Soviet resistance and relief that their countries did not fall under Soviet control. Jews remember the Holocaust, which in this alternate reality was even more extensive. The loss of Moscow gave the Germans more time for genocide. Perhaps not 6 million died, but 8 or 10. This is an unhealed wound. And what of technology? Would it have advanced faster or slower in a world where Moscow fell? On one hand, America, without competition from the USSR, might have grown complacent. There would be no space race of the same intensity, no comparable pressure on scientific advancement. On the other hand, America is wealthier and stronger. It can invest more in science. Perhaps technological progress accelerates. The internet emerges earlier, computers develop faster. Biotechnology, medicine, all receive greater funding. In this alternate reality, the USSR is poorer. Science suffers. Perhaps there are fewer Nobel laureates. Brain drain is more severe. Scientists emigrate to the West, but stubbornness remains. Breakthroughs still occur in traditionally strong fields like mathematics and physics. By the 21st century, the world in this alternate timeline looks familiar, but the details are different. America dominates more strongly, Russia is weaker, Europe is barely united, and Asia develops differently. And over it all hangs the memory of 1941, when Moscow fell. There is another aspect worth considering: alternate history within alternate history. What if, in this world where Moscow fell, there are people who ponder, what if Moscow had not fallen? How would the world look then? And they imagine our reality. A world where the USSR triumphed, where Soviet troops took Berlin, where Stalin became a victorious hero, where the USSR became a superpower, where the Cold War was tense, where the space race was thrilling. And they think, now that would have been a story. This reminds us, we live in one of an infinite number of possible histories. Moscow did not fall in 1941, but it was not predestined. It was the result of the courage of Soviet soldiers, Zhukov's determination, Siberian frosts, timely reinforcements, mistakes by German command, and countless other factors. Change one, and everything could have gone differently. The Germans were so close, just a few kilometers away. One breakthrough, one weakness in the defense, and the swastika could have flown over the Kremlin. But it did not happen. Moscow held, and this determined the course of the entire war. The first major victory over the Wehrmacht proved that Hitler was not invincible. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. We remember the heroes of Moscow's defense, the Panfilov men, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, the thousands of nameless soldiers who froze in the trenches but did not retreat. They saved not only Moscow, they saved history from the nightmare we just imagined.
Of course, the USSR under Stalin was a brutal, totalitarian regime. Millions perished in the Gulag, victims of repression and famine. But in the context of the war, the choice was between two monstrous regimes, and the USSR's victory meant that at least Nazism was destroyed. In the alternate reality, where Moscow fell, Nazism might have endured longer, perhaps for decades. The Holocaust would have been more extensive. Slavic peoples would have faced genocide. The Ost plan would have been implemented. Millions would have been enslaved. This did not happen because Moscow held, because Soviet soldiers fought to the last, because Zhukov found the strength for a counteroffensive, because history chose a different path. So when we ponder alternate history, we are not merely playing what if. We understand how fragile reality is, how thin the line between victory and defeat, between triumph and catastrophe. Moscow could have fallen in 1941, but it held. And this miracle is no less profound than any other in history. This is the alternate history we have imagined. Dark, terrifying, but instructive. It shows how crucial those December days of 1941 were, how much depended on every decision, every order, every shot. I hope you found this descent into a nightmarish scenario intriguing. If so, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to leave a comment.